The next thing that we're going to do is add a few splines in here. So from our sketch dropdown, we're going to hit spline. We're going to go from this point to this point and say OK. And then we'll go from this point to this point and say OK. And then escape to end the spline tool. Now we need to come back and add some relations. The green lines and the green points are the spline handles. These are going to allow us to modify the direction and the weight of these handles. Now you do want to be careful because they do have a tendency to snap to vertical and they want to snap to those constraints. So it's a good idea when you start dragging them to hold down the control key. Now the selection process when you're defining a spline is very specific. You must select either the endpoint or the spline handle line depending on what exactly you want to apply. So for instance, I grabbed the spline handle line, control select our reference line, and then I can come down and apply a perpendicular relation. Select the spline over here, make sure that I can grab that handle, again control select, we want to come and apply another perpendicular relation. Next, we're going to use D on the keyboard to apply a dimension from this point to this point. And again, we want to make sure that these are ordinate dimensions. This is going to be 10 millimeters. From this point to this point, we're going to have 5 millimeters. So what we've done is we've set the direction and the weight of the spline as it exits this line, this reference line here. And now we need to come down and do the same at the bottom. Select the spline, and whenever you have a dimension in the way, sometimes it's a good idea just to move it, just to make sure that you're selecting the appropriate reference. We'll do a perpendicular relation with this one. And on this side, we're actually not going to do a perpendicular relation, but we're going to select the spline so that we can see the handle. Hit D on the keyboard. We'll select it, select our reference line. You might need to select it one more time. And 80 degrees is going to be our reference angle. And then we want to do an ordinate dimension from here to here. This one's going to be 5, and then a dimension from here to here. And this one is also going to be 5. So now what we've done is we've given both of our splines fully defined status. We've given them direction and weight as they enter and exit their start and end points. So now this sketch is fully defined, it's complete. We can go ahead and stop the sketch. The next thing that we want to do is use some of these to create the rest of our references. So we're going to use our construct dropdown to create planes at angle. We're going to select the upper reference line and we're going to select 90 degrees. We'll follow the same process, and again, don't forget your marking menu. Right click, you can repeat the plane at angle. Very quickly grab this, 90 degrees, and we've created our two reference planes. So from here we're going to start a sketch on this plane, so we'll select it, right click, and create a sketch. Now for this process I like to rotate this a bit. I don't necessarily like to look at it, look normal too. I like to rotate it a bit so I can see what I'm working with. And I'm going to bring in this as a reference line. So using the sketch dropdown, we'll go to project include. And remember, we want to avoid include 3D geometry because by default sketches in Fusion 360 are 3D sketches. So you can get into trouble if it's not exactly on plane, so you want to be careful when you use that. So we'll project this line and say OK. So this does a few things for us. We can go ahead and expand our sketches folder and we can hide sketch 2. It brings in this line, which is purple. We're going to go ahead and select it and make it construction, and it gives us the endpoint references. Using L on the keyboard for the line tool, we're going to use this point and drag a line straight down, say OK. The other point, drag a line straight down and say OK. And then its midpoint and drag a line straight up and say OK. Then we'll hit escape. We'll convert all three of these to construction. And then we want to dimension the center line. So D on the keyboard, we'll grab this line and we're going to give it a vertical dimension of 5 millimeters. Now the reason that we have these lines are typically there for reference. It's a good idea, a good indicator for you to have these lines as references because we're going to draw a spline that's going to indicate the cross section of the loft that we're going to do. So from sketch, we'll go to spline, go from this point, add a midpoint, and go all the way over here and say OK. Now remember with these spline handles, when we start to drag them, we start to move them around, we can do things like apply a vertical relation. So I can come down and I can say vertical horizontal and it'll snap that to vertical. Now, the reason that I did not want to do that in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and delete the vertical relation, is just in case later on we decide that we don't want a vertical relation here, or we don't want that specific relation, or the entire design twists inside of our coordinate system. So in this case, my reference is going to be this line, control select the spline, and we're going to apply a tangency. So in this case, they're really the exact same thing because our reference lines are vertical, but this does give us the freedom to move things around, to be able to move things around just a little bit. The last thing I need to do is dimension those lines. So again, we're going to D on the keyboard from this point to this point. We're going to give it a 1 millimeter. From this point to this point, 1 millimeter. So what's happening now, because this line right here is perpendicular to our reference line that we projected into our sketch, when we mirror our spline, we know that it's going to have tangency going across that mirror line. And that's very important because inside of Fusion 360, when we decide to do a loft and we use the splines that signify the shape of this thing, when we use those as our guide curves, we don't really have a good way to control direction or tangency. Even if we do an extrude and we have a face or an edge there, as a guide curve for a loft, it really doesn't allow us the type of options that you may or may not be used to for applying tangency. So we're going to control this just a little bit differently, and we're going to do the top and bottom profile, which in general I avoid when I'm dealing with something that's symmetric, but in this case we're going to go ahead and use that option. So we're going to take our spline and we're simply going to mirror it across this and say okay. And this right here is going to be the cross section at this point. Now if you want to modify this at all, we can simply come in here and modify these dimensions. We can say that we actually want this to be 2 millimeters on this side and 2 millimeters on this side, and you can see the change that it has in the profile. So depending on the design, depending on the intent, what we might want to change later on, we can control those things. And notice that now that the mirror is in there, it does have a mirror relation, and it's able to modify those as well on the bottom and the top. Now we also do have a third spline handle here, and you'll notice that it's here. I haven't touched it, I haven't activated it, but we could come in, we could grab it, and you might have to zoom in to select it. Control select this reference line and make those perpendicular. So it's likely going to be a good idea to make sure that you have these fully defined sketches. In this case, I want to let everything float because I don't, especially when I'm dealing with organic shapes, I don't like to over define them. I like to let the splines sort of do their thing where I don't have to define them. I know that I need this to be 5 millimeters tall at this point. I know that I need it to have tangency going across here. And other than that, I really don't have a very stringent list of specs in terms of this profile here. I just know that I need it to be nice and smooth and organic. So for this design, for this instance, we're going to leave it underdefined, which in general, again, I avoid that. But in this case, this is actually what I want to do. I want to leave it underdefined to make sure that the shape is not pushed or pulled or stressed into something that it shouldn't be.